culture ever brought into being by the human imagination in terms of its expanse. And that, of course, brings us to Polynesia. Tens of thousands of islands flung like jewels upon the southern seas. And I was very fortunate to be invited by my good friend Nainoa Thompson and the Polynesian Voyaging Society to sail on the iconic vessel, the sacred canoe of Hawaii, known as Hokulea, named after the star. And even today, the sailors of the Polynesian Voyaging Society can name 250 to 300 stars in the night sky. They can sense the presence of distant atolls of islands beyond the visible horizon simply by watching the reverberation of waves across the hull of the vessel, knowing full well that every island group in the Pacific has its own unique reflective pattern that can be read with the same ease with which a forensic scientist would read a fingerprint. These are sailors who in the darkness of the vessel can sense as many as 6 different swells moving through the canoe, distinguishing those caused by local weather patterns from the deep currents that pulsate across the ocean and can be followed with the same ease with which a terrestrial explorer would follow a river to the sea. Indeed, if you took all of the genius that allowed us to put a man on the moon and applied it to an understanding of the ocean, what you would have is Polynesia. But the most amazing thing about this tradition is that it was based on dead reckoning. Dead reckoning means that you only know where you are by remembering precisely how you got there. Now, it was the impossibility of using that methodology on a long oceanic voyage that kept most European transports hugging the shores of continents until the British solved the problem of longitude with the invention of the chronometer. But we know for a scientific fact that 10 centuries before Christ, from an ancient civilization called Lapita on the northern shores of New Guinea, west of New Caledonia, the ancestors of the Polynesians set sail into the rising sun. In 1,000 years, they reached Samoa and Tonga, and then they waited. But then they sailed on, 4,000 kilometers across the Central Pacific, northwest to Hawaii, southeast to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and then, of course, at the time of the First Crusade, reaching what we call New Zealand. And what this implied was that in a civilization that did not have the written word, the wayfinder sitting monk-like on the vessel stern had to remember every shift of wind, every tack, every sign of the stars, the moon, the sun, and other signs of the sea. And if that train of knowledge was broken, if he fell asleep or she fell asleep, the voyage would be lost. And so that was the great achievement of the Polynesians. And this vessel, as we sit here, is now sailing from Galapagos to Rapa Nui, having completed a circumnavigation of the world. Now, if we move from the greatest ocean culture, if you will, to the greatest forest on Earth, we enter the heart of the Amazon, a forest the size of the continental United States, or more poetically put, the size of the face of the full moon. We come into the homeland of the people of the Anaconda, the Barasana, the Makuna, the Tanimukos, people that live so closely to the forest that cognitively they do not distinguish the color blue from the color green, because the canopy of the forest is equated to the canopy of the rainforest, of the heavens. Or if we come down the Andean Cordillera into the homeland of the Waorani, one of the most remarkable peoples I've ever visited, remarkable in part because though they live but 130 kilometers from Quito, they were first peacefully contacted as late as 1958, 5 years after I was born. In 1956, 5 missionaries attempted contact and made a critical mistake. They dropped from the air 8 by 10 glossy photographs of themselves in what we would say were friendly gestures, forgetting that the people of the rainforest had never seen anything two-dimensional in their lives. So they picked the photographs up, looked behind the face to try to find the form to the figure, found nothing, and concluded that these were calling cards from the devil, and so they speared the 5 missionaries to death. But the Waorani didn't just spear outsiders. We traced genealogies back 8 generations and found 54% of male mortality was due to them spearing each other. We found 2 cases of natural death in all of that time, and when they admitted that one of the fellows had gotten so old that he died getting old, so he speared him anyway. Everybody's not nice. But they had a perspicacious knowledge of the forest that was amazing. Their hunters could smell animal urine at 40 paces and tell you what form of life had left that behind. Again, not because they were sauvage in a Rousseauian sense, but because they were true natural philosophers who had paid attention to the forest homeland upon which their lives depended. And it was exactly that knowledge that drew us as ethnobotanists into the Amazon. And I must digress and say that I was so fortunate to attend Harvard College when I did, because I fell into the orbit of the legendary plant explorer Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938. In 1941, he took a semester's leave of absence from the university and disappeared into the northwest Amazon of Colombia, where he remained for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of the Amazon rainforest. He was an odd choice to become a 60s icon because his politics were wildly conservative. He didn't vote for the Republican Party. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. One of his colleagues said the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. And I knew none of this history when at the age of 19, I knocked on his fourth floor Erie office at Botanical Museum, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British Columbia." That's all it took. British. I'm from British Columbia. He thought I was talking about that Columbia. I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon and collect plants like you did. At the time, I had never taken a course in botany, even in high school. I knew nothing about the Amazon, and the man for whom mountains had been named in Colombia simply peered across a mound of plant specimens and said very simply, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I was in the Amazon, where I stayed on that first sojourn for 15 months. But just before I left, he had me in his office for some advice. He said, "Don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck." And then he said, "Don't come back without trying ayahuasca, the most potent of all the hallucinogenic preparations." I didn't think this advice was really going to get me anywhere. And then he said, "Always remember that the difference between a poison, a medicine, narcotic, and hallucinogen is just dosage." And that actually was, in that he was quoting from the great Greek scholar Paracelsus, and that really was the foundation of modern pharmacology, because that's quite true. I mean, for example, D-tubocurarine, the famous muscle relaxant, was derived from curare, the flying death. The arrow poisons don't kill the prey by poisoning them. They cause the prey to lose muscular control, and they fall from the canopy of the forest. So we were always on the outlook for any biodynamic plants, and that invariably led us into the realm of the shaman. Now, if you follow the great work of ethnographers like Shirley MacLaine, you would think that the shaman is a kind of a benign grandfather figure who sings a lot. I've been with shaman all my career, and I've never met one who wasn't psychotic. That's their job, as Joseph Campbell said. They're the ones who swim in the mystic waters the rest of us would drown in. They're the ones who go into these metaphysical spaces that most human beings, including their own tribal members, want to avoid at all costs. And the essence of shamanic healing is based on a very different notion, of course, of the nature of disease, where in that disease is not defined by the presence or absence of pathogens, but rather as a state of disequilibrium, imbalance, in which the physical and spiritual components are not in their proper rest. And is to address that imbalance, the shaman must invoke some technique of ecstasy to soar away on the wings of trance, to get into those distant metaphysical realms where he or she can work their deeds of magical, medical, mystical rescue. And that accounts for one of the most curious anomalies in botanical science. Of the 120 known hallucinogenic plants, fully 95% are from the Americas. Not because the forests of Southeast Asia or West Africa were depauperate, but people there had other roots to their spirit world, to the divine. In the Americas and in Siberia, the root was always facilitated by these curious plants, like this one in a photograph that Schultes took in 1954 when he discovered this curious preparation known as ebene, the semen of the sun, here being used by the Yanomami. It's a blood-red resin of several forest trees that is chock full of serotonin-like tryptamines, 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine, To have this stuff blown up your nose is a little bit like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It creates not the distortion of reality, it creates a disillusion of reality. I used to argue with Professor Schultes that we couldn't classify this as hallucinogenic because by the time you're under the influence, there was no one home anymore to experience the hallucinations. But the reason we're interested in these plants is not just their dazzling pharmacological effects, but what they tell us about a different way of knowing. And this is really fascinating. The reason the Yanomami blow those snuffs up the nose is that tryptamines are orally inactive. They can't be taken through the mouth because they're denatured by an enzyme found naturally in the human stomach called monoamine oxidase. They can only be taken orally if taken with some other chemical that momentarily denatures the MAO. Now, the legendary preparation of the Northwest Amazon is ayahuasca. It's not a plant, it's a preparation. The leaves of a nondescript shrub, chock full of these tryptamines, and the woody bark of a liana in a totally different group of plants, which have within it beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, which turn out to be MAO inhibitors of the precise sort necessary to potentiate the tryptamines in the leaves. Now, you don't have to worry about that chemistry, but think about this. How, in a flora of 80,000 species of vascular plants, did the indigenous people learn to combine these morphologically distinct denizens of the rainforest to create this powerful synergistic effect? Our only scientific explanation is trial and error, which statistically is quickly exposed as a meaningless euphemism. You ask the Indians, and they say, well, the plants teach us. What does that mean? When Schultes was with the Siona sequoia in 1941 in eastern Ecuador, he recorded 17 varieties of the woody vine, all of which, to his Harvard-trained taxonomic eye, was the same species. And yet the indigenous people recognized them consistently at great distances in the forest. When he finally asked for the nature of their classification, they of course looked at him as if he was an idiot. Any proper botanist would already know that you take each one of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each variety sings to you in a different key. Now, that's not going to get you a PhD in plant systematics at Cornell, but it's a hell of a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. And it also speaks of a different way of knowing. And this is so important when we think a little deeper into the Amazon. You know, remember in the 70s there was all that talk about the delicacy of the Amazon, a castle of biological sophistication on a foundation of sand, take away the forest, and you set in motion a chain reaction of biological destruction. Well, that fit an environmental agenda, and it fit what we thought Indian life had been like in the Amazon, because our vision of it was informed by people like the Waorani, small societies marrying amongst themselves in open conflict with their neighbors. But what about the great civilizations that Aureliana reported when he went down the Amazon in 1541? Civilizations, the shadows of which archaeologists are only now beginning to discover throughout the Amazon. Is there a place where the great civilizations can still be heard? The answer is yes, amongst the people of the Anaconda. These are societies that live in these great longhouses that in their architectural resonance and sophistication rival anything the Inca or the Maya ever built. These are societies with knowledge, traditions, and social rules that facilitate trade and exchange, not conflict, not the least of which is a marriage rule that says you must marry somebody who speaks a different language. And so in any one longhouse, you have 6 and 7 languages spoken. You never hear a child practicing a distinct tongue. They wait, watch, and listen, and one day begin to speak. We now understand that their entire cosmology amounts to nothing more or less than a sophisticated land management plan that dictates precisely how people can live in great numbers in the Amazon. Now, all of this could so readily have been lost. In the 1970s, this whole region of Colombia felt like a place where something important happened a long time ago. The missionaries ran the show, the people were demoralized, but then an amazing thing happened. The president of Colombia said to a friend of mine, Martin van Hildebrand, an anthropologist, do something for the Indians. And in 5 incredible years as head of Indian Affairs, Martin set aside legal tenure to a land area collectively the size of the United Kingdom for the 57 ethnicities of the northwest Amazon of Colombia. And behind the veil of isolation created by the chaos of that era in Colombian history, a new dream of culture was reborn. And when I made this recent film, Stephen Hugh Jones, who had predicted in the 60s that all these cultures would quote unquote disappear, flew in to join us. And as he walked into the longhouse, 250 men and women in full ritual regalia celebrating cassava woman in a 3-day celebration of fertility, he took one look, spun around, got on the satellite phone and called his wife in London and said, "Christine, you can't believe my eyes. The only thing that disappeared are the bloody missionaries." And we asked the elders why they allowed the missionaries to do what they did, to stay so long. And they said something very profound: because they promised to make us human. And that's the essence of colonization, to persuade the colonized of their own inherent inferiority. And now a whole new dream of culture has been born in the northwest Amazon. Well, if we slip from the Amazon up into the Andes, it allows us to explore what I call sacred geography. I was very fortunate that before leaving Harvard under the guidance of Schultes, he told me to look up his man in Colombia, his protege, Tim Plowman, because he had secured for Tim the absolutely greatest academic grant of the 1970s. $250,000, which is a lot of money then, and a brand new fire engine red Dodge 4x4 pickup truck to study a plant known to the Inca as a divine leaf of immortality. And this was coca, the notorious source of cocaine. And it was astonishing because even though cocaine hydrochloride, then as now, is our most important topical anesthetic in modern medicine, and even though the illicit trade was beginning in the early 70s, very little was known about the botany of the plant. Nobody knew how many species yielded the drug. Nobody knew its point of origin. Nobody had ever done a nutritional study of the plant, even though it's consumed every day by South American peoples in the millions. We knew that in the time of the Inca, the plant had been revered as none other. You could not approach a holy shrine, unable to grow it at the altitude of the imperial capital of Cusco. The Inca replicated it in fields of gold and silver that colored the landscape. And we knew that today no event occurs in the Andes without some kind of reciprocal exchange of the energy of the sacred leaf with the Apu deities, the mountains that determine the destiny of the living. And we did do the first nutritional study of coca, and what we found horrified our backers at the US government. Yes, it had a small amount of cocaine in it, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean, and no one noticed the irony that at every drug abuse conference, all the narcs bolted for the coffee pot at 10 o'clock in the morning. But this small amount of alkaloid was absorbed benignly through the mucous membrane of the mouth. The plant was chock full of vitamins. It had more calcium than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a diet that traditionally lacked a dairy product, particularly for young mothers. It also had enzymes which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the potato diet of the Andes. So in one simple assay that could have been done 60 years before, we put into stark profile the draconian efforts that are still underway to eradicate the traditional fields, and we showed that this was a plant that had been used traditionally with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for 4,000 years by the pre-Columbian peoples of the Americas. And so with coca as my lens, both literally and metaphorically, I began to think of the way Andean people connected to their landscape. You know, we often invoke notions of the ecological native to try to explain that somehow native people were closer to the land than we can be. An idea that's not only silly but racist in its simplicity. Indigenous people are neither sentimental nor weakened by nostalgia, but they have created a kind of traditional mystique of the earth that's based not on the idea of being close to it, but rather on the idea that the earth itself can only exist because it's filtered through the human imagination. And so in the Andes, there's a very deep sense of reciprocity that informs economics of the society, but also cosmological ideas. And this reciprocity, and again, this idea of sacred geography is not hippie ethnography. In other words, what do I really mean by that? How do we explain what we do to the earth? I was raised in British Columbia. I worked as a logger. I was raised to believe the forest existed to be cut. That made me very different from my First Nation friends who believed that those forests were the abode of spirits that had to be embraced during the Hamatsa initiation. I was raised to believe a mountain's a pile of rock ready to be mined. Made me different than my godson in Peru, who believes that a mountain is an Apu deity that will direct his destiny. Again, it's not about who's right and who's wrong. It's paying attention to the metaphor and how the metaphor defines the impact of the ecological footprint of the particular culture. A child raised to believe that a mountain is a deity will be less inclined to tear it apart looking for coal than a child like myself raised to believe that that mountain is inert in a world where, as Saul Bellow said, science has made a house cleaning of belief. Now, in the Andes, these ideas play out in ritual in rather marvelous ways. This is my godson, one of maybe 15 children I've baptized in the community of Chinchero outside of Cusco. And once each year, an amazing event happens where the fastest boy of every hamlet in the valley is given the honor of becoming a woman. And for one day, he puts on the clothing of his sister or his mother, and he has to lead all able-bodied men on a run. But it's not your ordinary run. You start off at 11,500 feet, you run 2,000 feet down to the base of the sacred mountain, and then you run to 16,000 feet, fall away to the sacred mountain, and cross 2 more soaring Andean ridges over the course of a very long ritual day. And the metaphor is so beautiful. You go into the mountain as an individual, but through exhaustion and sacrifice, and remember the word sacrifice in English is derived from the Latin word to make sacred, you fuse into a single community pulse that has once again redefined your sense of place on the planet, but also your obligations to that place. Now, in what my wife is always referring to my multiple midlife crises, at the age of 48, I became the oldest person and the only outsider ever to participate in this full ritual. And I actually finished the day running with the Wailakas, but I only was able to do so by chewing more coca leaves in one day than anyone in the 4,000-year history of the plant. But what really got me through the day, that all those kids I had baptized and raised and educated and bought cows for the family, when they heard that their padrino was stupid enough to run the movimiento at the age of 48, they all clustered around me, clinging to me like limpets all day long. They weren't going to let anything happen to their cash cow. But these localized rituals become pan-Andean in these fantastic events like the Star Snow Festival, which is a perfect fusion of 500 years of Catholic faith with pre-Columbian ideas. It's like a kind of Andean Woodstock. In this sacred valley, tens of thousands of people arrive as the Pleiades reemerge in the sky. They bring the crosses from their community churches on their backs in this extraordinary pilgrimage. The crosses then are carried high in the shadow of the most sacred mountain of the Inca, Ausangati, and planted in the ice for 48 hours to absorb the power of the earth, and then taken back to the communities empowered by Pachamama. If that's kind of an example of the fusion of the two worlds that came together in 1492, there is one place where the pre-Columbian voice can still be heard unfettered, and that's in this extraordinary volcanic massif that rises to 20,000 feet from the Caribbean coastal plain, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, homeland of the elder brother, the Wiwa, the Cancuano, the Arahuacos, and the Kogi, descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization that in the wake of the conquest fled into these mountains, and in a bloodstained continent, they alone were never conquered by the Spanish, and they remain ruled by a ritual priesthood. But the training for the priesthood is rather astonishing. A great Colombian anthropologist in the 1940s said that the acolytes were taken from their families at the age of 3, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which time they learned the religious ideas that are so Baroque. And those ideas include the idea that their prayers and rituals alone maintain the cosmic or ecological balance of the world. And then Reichel reported they're taken out at the age of 18, having never seen a sunrise, a horizon, a landscape, and they're suddenly taken on a journey to the heart of the world, to the ice fields that cloak the Mother Goddess Mountain, Saranqua. And the priest who has trained them sort of says, you see, it's as I've told you all these years. It's that beautiful. It's yours to protect. Well, this was almost a fable in anthropology because Reichel never saw this happen. It seemed almost too good to be true. But then an amazing thing happened. This man, Danilo Villafana, walked into my office at the National Geographic with the Colombian ambassador, Carolina Barco. And he had 3 priests with him, barefoot, in the winter in Washington. And as he was chatting me up, he had a proposal. They're very politically hip. Well, actually what had happened is the BBC had made a film with the Kogi and sort of said the Kogi were the real elder brothers, and that really pissed these guys off. And they wanted the National Geographic to make their film. That was his pitch. And I said, well, that's cool, but I just have to tell you, you look like an old friend of mine. And I pulled out a photograph that I had taken in 1974 of the man who turned out to be his father, Adalberto, and his father had been murdered by the paramilitaries. And so I said, Danilo, I don't want to shock you, but I know you because when you were a baby, I carried you for months on my back with your father up and down the slopes of your homeland. And this was such an emotional thing for him. We became super friends, and he invited me to actually make a film of a journey to the heart of the world. And what we discovered is that today the acolytes don't stay in the darkness for 18 years, but they never leave the environs of the sacred temple for 18 years. Much of it at night, learning this extraordinarily complex religious set of ideas that have led many to sort of say they're the Tibetans of South America. And then they do go on a journey to the heart of the world, from the ice to the sea and from the sea back to the ice. Every ripple in the landscape resonates with cosmological and mythological significance. Even the hats they wear are a conscious effort to mimic the snowfields that are found at the heart of the world. And we were at the penultimate stage of the pilgrimage when we arrived and found the mamos in a circle praying. And when they pray, they move their fingers because their prayers are seen to be threads. Their main metaphor is the loom. They say, upon this loom I weave my life. When they move up and down the mountain, they describe their movements as threads, so that over the course of a lifetime you weave a cloak over the goddess, the body of the goddess. And clearly these mamos were concerned because what had happened is the FARC had come through that community that afternoon planning to kidnap us, and we were mercifully delayed 6 hours. And being kidnapped by the FARC today, in fact, just this afternoon I got word that my son-in-law to-be just got kidnapped today by the FARC. In fact, on the Rio Apaporis, we're quite concerned about it, but we think he's very clever and he's French and he speaks perfect Spanish, and if anyone can talk himself out of kidnapping, it'll be Jules. And also with peace, the FARC is kind of a little bit not so dangerous. But at any rate, in this era, they were truly dangerous. And so we had to hand over the cameras to our colleagues who we had trained to finish this section of the film, and you don't really have a dramatic escape on a mule. You kind of clip-clop your way to rescue. But we had a firefight in the morning with the Colombian army, and we just had come into a hornet's nest. But we just came back to the coast where even though the sacred sites are covered by construction in places, it doesn't stop the Wiwa and the Kogi and here the Arawakos praying every single day for our collective well-being. And it's humbling to think that 2 hours from Miami Beach, this ancient civilization, vibrant today as it was 500 years ago, is earnestly and in full paragraphs and full articulation asking us, the younger brother, to stop ruining the planet. Well, I've always lived by the adage of Picasso that if it works, it's obsolete. And after 5 years in South America, I was keen to see other parts of the world. And with Schultes, there was always something waiting for you. And one winter day in Boston in 1982, he summoned me to his office and asked me casually whether I was interested in going to the Caribbean island nation of Haiti, infiltrating the secret societies, and securing the formula of a folk poison used to make zombies. Well, naturally, I said yes. And I went to Haiti thinking that it would be a lark. It had ended up consuming 4 years of my life, because within hours of arriving in the Afro-Caribbean reality, something was made available to me that had in fact eluded me in South America, and that was truly a window wide open to the mystic. You know, it's interesting, were I to ask you the name, the great religions of the world, what would you say? Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism. What continent's left out? Sub-Saharan Africa. The tacit assumption being that Africans south of the Sahara had no religion. Well, of course they did. And voodoo is not a black magic cult. It's simply a word from the phone language of Dahomey that means spirit or God. In many ways, voodoo is a quintessentially democratic faith because the believer not only has direct access to the divine, he or she actually becomes the spirit. That's why Haitians say, you white people go to church and speak about God. We dance in the temple and become God. And indeed, in the African reality, people move in and out of their spirit realm with an ease and impunity that is astonishing to the ethnographic observer. And that's why you see these theatrical gestures, someone cutting into their skin before the fetish symbol in Benin, or here more profoundly in Haiti, voodoo acolytes in a state of trance handling burning embers with impunity, a rather astonishing example of the mind's ability to affect the body that bears it when catalyzed in a state of extreme excitation. If you ask yourself, why did we start thinking of voodoo as a black magic cult, you just have to look into your history. Haiti was the only independent black nation for 100 years. They bought shipments of slaves destined for the American slave market, granted them freedom. They funded Simon Bolivar on the condition that he free the slaves of Gran Colombia. In the 1920s, the U.S. Marines, in a kind of a gesture of manifest destiny, occupied Haiti and stayed for 20 years. And the Marines were mostly from the American South during the era of Jim Crow, and every one of them seemed to get a book contract. And the books had names like Cannibal Cousins, Black Baghdad, Voodoo Fire in Haiti, The White King of La Gonave, The Magic Island, A Puritan in Voodoo Land. All of these books were filled with pins and needles and voodoo dolls that don't exist, zombies crawling out of the grave to attack people, and children bred for the cauldron. They gave rise to the RKO movies of the 40s, Night of the Living Dead. And they essentially suggested to the American public during the era of Jim Crow that any country where such abominations occurred could only find its redemption through military occupation, which is one reason that when I first went to Haiti to do my research, if you can believe it, there were more Western missionary organizations in Haiti than individual Western-trained doctors. And of course, voodoo is not a black magic cult. Zombies exist. It's a form of social sanction invoked in a very rational way by the secret societies, who are the most powerful arbiter of social and political life in Haiti. And if you want to learn anything more about zombies, you've got to read the book. We have this idea that these cultures, quaint and colorful though they may be, are somehow destined to fade away as if by natural laws. If they're indeed failed attempts at being us, failed attempts at being modern, nothing could be further from the truth. Technology is never a threat to culture. Change, as I said, is never a threat to culture. What is a threat to culture is power. And in every case, these are dynamic, living peoples, not fading away from history, being driven out of history by identifiable forces. And that's actually an optimistic observation, because it suggests if human beings are the agents of cultural destruction, we could be the facilitators of cultural survival. Now, I wrote a book about my Haitian experience that was made into the worst movie in Hollywood history. And Hemingway said, if you sell a book to Hollywood, you should start off in Arizona, drive to the California state line, throw your book over, and go back to Tucson and have a drink. I didn't do that. I disappeared into the forests of Borneo. I wanted to live in a place wet with the innocence of birth. I always wanted to live with nomads, because we were all once nomads.